Welcome to the ultimate book summary of Step by Step to Stand-Up Comedy by Greg Dean. Greg Dean is a pioneering figure in the world of comedy education. 40 years ago, he identified a gap in the industry. No one was teaching comedy using the basics. Driven by his passion for the craft, Greg set aside his own illustrious career to become a dedicated stand-up comedy teacher. His impressive background includes performance on Saturday Night Live, stints as a clown, and a ringmaster with the Ringling Bros Circus, as well as regular gigs at the renowned Comedy Store. Despite these accomplishments, Greg's true calling was to impart his knowledge and skills, helping countless aspiring comedians to succeed in the art of stand-up comedy. So, Step by Step to Stand-Up Comedy is an invaluable guide for anyone interested in the art of stand-up comedy. From understanding joke structures and writing funny punchlines to developing your own comedic style, the book covers a wide range of topics essential to both beginners and seasoned comedians. In this summary, we'll explore the key insights and strategies the author shares to help you take your comedy to the next level. And we will be covering, as we said before, Tris, that we're going to do the first sort of 5 or so chapters, because later on in the book, I think from chapter 6 to maybe 12 or 14, or however long it goes on for, it really gets into the sort of the depths of creating your own routine, practicing your routine, etc. We're just trying to sort of summarize the joke part because that was what interested us the most. So how to create a joke, how to structure a punchline, etc., etc. So more of the practical aspects of actually creating the jokes in the first place. And then if you're really interested in obviously becoming a stand-up comedian or whatnot, then definitely check out the book and read the rest of it, where it goes into rehearsing and practicing point of views, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So without further ado, let's go on to chapter 1, Secrets of Joke Structure. So most people think a joke is something that makes others laugh. But this idea doesn't really explain what a joke is. It only talks about what it's supposed to do. Interestingly, even if a joke doesn't make us laugh, we can still tell it's a joke. This is because jokes have a special pattern that everyone can recognize. So what are jokes and how do they work? To understand jokes, we need to understand the humble one-liner. So traditionally, one-liner jokes comprise 2 parts. Number 1, the setup, and 2, the punch. So what does this have to do with jokes? Well, at its core, it reveals the essence of what a joke is. So here are the 2 core elements of a joke: expectation and surprise. The setup and punchline of a joke are all about building up an expectation and then delivering a surprise. For a joke to be funny, it needs to catch you off guard. But to be surprised, you first need to have an expectation of what's coming next. That's what a joke does. It sets you up to expect one thing, then surprises you with something else. So we can say that the setup of a joke creates anticipation, while the punchline unveils something unexpected.
So, how do jokes work then? We got the first and second story. So what makes something a joke? In an article called Jokes from Psychology Today in October 1985, Victor Raskin introduced a concept called a script-based semantic theory of humor, which doesn't sound very fun, does it?
Wow.
Suggesting that a joke consists of 2 scripts or scenarios. Greg Dean has adapted Raskin's ideas by changing script to story, which lets him apply his theory to all humor films, not just verbal jokes. If a joke lacks this 2-story structure, it's not truly a joke. A punchline without a second story might present a single narrative, but it doesn't fulfill the joke's criteria. So we got the first part, which is the setup and the first story. The setup of a joke involves the words or actions that prompt us to anticipate something. The first story then is what we imagine to be true based on the setup. This story is crafted from our assumptions and limited information provided by the setup. So now you've got the punchline and the second story. So the punchline is the part that surprises us, offering words or actions that lead us to envision a second story. This second story aligns with the setup, yet it is unexpected, crafted again from our assumptions. An important point is that much of what makes a joke work is the information not explicitly stated in the setup or punchline, information we will fill in through our assumptions. If we can't see, hear, feel, taste, or smell something, we assume it exists based on our inability to directly perceive it. This is because we have a deep need for things to make sense. When something doesn't make sense, we instinctively fill in the gaps with our past experiences and assumptions. So, throughout this book, he's littered in sort of like joke secrets. We're going to cover all the ones that we're going to cover in the chapters from 1 to 5, but the rest you have to read the book to find out. So we've got joke secret number 1. A joke begins by setting up a first story in our minds. leading us to anticipate something. Then the punchline hits us with a second story that fits with the first, but in an unexpected way. And we will get onto some examples later, which will sort of showcase these points. Then we've got secret 2. So everything we imagine but cannot directly see or sense is based on assumptions. And it kind of reminds me a lot. In some sense, comedy is similar to what magicians do, where they sort of take advantage of the fact that our perception is limited, and they use our assumptions against us to create comedy. Whereas I guess with the magicians, it's almost using our limitations of perception and where our attention is based to create what is perceived as magic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really interesting actually, because a magician is preying on the current perception or your current assumptions, right? Your assumptions based on what someone is witnessing. But it's interesting with a joke because the assumptions that are linked to one of the stories, okay, one of the scripts, are like generic assumptions. So the comedian has to know that they also hold the assumptions, right? They are making an assumption that the audience holds certain assumptions. Otherwise, if he was saying something that is so unique to him that no one could understand because they can't fill in the gaps with his knowledge.
Yeah.
So you almost have to do something that, and it's just an interesting point that we have so many shared assumptions that we just
which is where most jokes will come from, because I feel like one of those things, when somebody's trying to be overly funny, and they almost come across weird, I think is when they have shared assumptions that aren't shared, and they think they are shared, so they just assume everybody. It's a bit like we joked about this before, where, for example, let's just say we've seen like a program, like we always joke about Love It from I can't even remember, Fired Up, whatever.
Fired Up, yeah.
Nobody else would get that because they don't have the assumptions or the relation to that idea. So quite a lot of people, if you just project your own assumptions onto others, you can end up, basically bombing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's fun. It's interesting, that really interesting. All right, so 3 mechanisms of joke structure. Every joke relies on 3 key mechanisms: target assumption, reinterpretation, and connector. Now, these mechanisms work together to create the surprise and humor that characterizes effective jokes. So the first mechanism is target assumption. The target assumption sets up the initial story by establishing an expected interpretation or scenario. It's the foundation of the first story that the audience is led to imagine. This assumption is critical because it's directly challenged by the punchline. It fulfills 2 main criteria. It's the key assumption for the first story's specific meaning, and it's directly shattered by the punchline, leading to an unexpected second story, creating the surprise or the humor. And it's interesting because this somewhat crosses over with neuroscience, where you have reward prediction error. We are creatures that see patterns, and so we try to predict things so that we don't have to spend so much energy on figuring stuff out, because we just like to go through things in a patterned way. But obviously reward prediction error is when suddenly there's a chink in the pattern and we pay loads of attention to it and we get this little dopamine spike. And it's the same thing that is going on with jokes. We're led to see that this story is going to end like this. This is the pattern. And then suddenly it changes and we're wakes up. Interesting. So then the second mechanism, reinterpretation. Following the setup that sets a target assumption, the punchline introduces a reinterpretation, an unexpected yet plausible alternative interpretation of the setup or shared piece of knowledge. This reinterpretation forms the basis of the second story and the punchline. It forces the audience to reconsider their initial assumptions, realizing that one of their assumptions was incorrect, leading to the humor. Reinterpretations come from the kind of mind that notices what others assume, then uncovers or invents alternative interpretations. To do this, comedians must be able to interpret one thing in at least 2 ways. Reinterpretations can also emerge from various creative processes, such as twists, satire, mockery, a quip, a wisecrack, etc.
Before you move on to the third mechanism, it's quite interesting because part of the third mechanism, which we get into, is called the connector, but it's being a good comedian and being quick on your feet, in my head, is trying to figure out words that have double meanings and then just knowing them off off the back, like the back of your hand or whatever. Like you said something a minute ago, which could have been defined as quite like in old times racist. You said a chink in the armor or something like that,
Okay,
like a Chinese man or something. You know what I mean? Like is that type of thing where you you literally you hear a word and you know
yeah,
it can mean two different things, and
yes,
then you then bring out that second meaning when you know the other person meant something else,
yeah,
and that
yeah,
is actually
exactly.
one of the essences of wit and humor in my head.
And that's why it's, obviously with words it's obvious that they do have different meanings, right? You can look those up, and then it's with ideas that can also mean something else. And
Yeah.
that's I think, being able to see something in a different way, an unconditioned way. And like a perfect example is someone like, Ricky Gervais, who will give an example of, seeing something in a completely different way that all of us just take for granted. We're all just, walking around like, the idea that people go to a gym and they're running on a treadmill in a box rather than running outside is like actually kind of weird when you think about it. But we're also used to it that like it just seems normal, right?
Exactly.
And it's like those kind of perceptions that a comedian has like
Well,
trained to be
yeah.
able to see things in a
It's
different
seeing
way.
the like you just said, like the original perceptions, the baseline assumptions that people make, that's normal, and then reinterpreting it in a way that allows people to see that actually, hang on a second, that isn't quite so normal as we originally thought.
Yeah.
But one thing I think the important point here, to some extent, again, is it has to be plausible and it has to be easily reinterpreted in a way that
Mhm.
people go, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because that's once again when somebody, we've all seen these people who crack jokes which just aren't funny, and
Yeah.
this is another way they fall, where they bring out this reinterpretation that everybody's just like, what? It's almost like confusing. It's weird, and like
Yeah.
weird humor does have its place, but sometimes if people don't get the reinterpretation and then you have to explain it, the joke is then lost.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. It is. I find it so fascinating actually when you look at the details and the nitty grittiness of like, a joke and what it is, or what humor is in general.
Yeah, we can
I
get
find it
further
really
into it. It's
fascinating.
really after you go on with the connector, and then afterwards, I think there's an example which really sort of illustrates these points because it's quite
Yeah,
good.
yeah. Okay, well, so the third mechanism is the connector. So at the center of a joke structure is the third mechanism, which Greg calls the connector, defined as one thing interpreted in at least two ways. So, interpreting the connector in one way provides the target assumption, and interpreting it in another supplies the reinterpretation. Connectors can have many possible interpretations. Two is simply the minimum required to construct a joke. This brings us to the connector's requirement. The connector must be only one thing. So, can jokes have more than one connector? Yes. Greg calls these compound jokes. Compound jokes have enough information or ambiguity in the setup to support two or sometimes even three connects in one joke.
Yeah. So now we're going to sort of put these into actual practice and see an
Mm,
example. So here's an example of the three mechanisms. So consider the joke. For Father's Day, I took my father out. I shot my priest. So the target assumption, the phrase "took my father out," initially suggests a kind gesture, like taking one's father to dinner or an event, forming the first story. The reinterpretation or the punchline "I shot my priest" suddenly shifts the meaning of "took out" to imply murder, offering an unexpected interpretation of the setup. So the connector there is the phrase "took my father out," and the reason why it's a connector is because it's interpretation transitioning from a positive gesture to a violent act. And I think this is an important point here with the connector. Is the best when it's like it's almost the
contrast.
opposite. When it's
Yeah.
the contrast is there. So this joke might also have been seen as having multiple connectors, because if the audience connects the concept of a father figure with both a biological father and a priest, which adds layers to the humor. So this
Yeah.
structure highlights how humor often plays in the dual interpretations of words or situations, leading the audience down one path only to surprise them with an unexpected turn, sparking laughter through the realization of the joke's clever construction. And I thought that's a good one. I think later on he might even reuse that again and um, add another sort of level to it, because it's interesting as well, because father is also another word that's so not even just the took out, it's the father as well, because it could be like once again priest, could be a
Yeah.
dad.
Yeah.
So there's lots of like funny things you can sort of play with, and it's really interesting when you start thinking this way how many words are up for sort of grabs to be reinterpreted.
So
And
many.
I think that's why it's quite interesting when you were saying a minute ago about training your mind as a comedian to try and see these words when you hear them, to just immediately be okay, right, we can use that in a different, or that could be interpreted in a completely different way.
I find it's such an interesting, because like I said, you can do it with words and you can do it with behavior where you're just reinterpreting them. I think behavior is probably more difficult, but in a weird way, we become so conditioned that we can't see outside of the normal pattern of using this word or behavior, and I find it the same with like, when a word is made up of like two words. So like, I can't even think of one right now, but like, it comes to us as almost just one word.
Yeah.
Because we say it as one word, but really it's made up of two.
What took out?
Sorry,
would took out be an example?
Not took out in this one. In this case, I don't think there would be, but it would be like, I don't know why this is coming to my mind, and I don't think it's a good example, but like StreamYard, how it's like a name. Yeah. I think of it as a name, but it's two words. But if I continue to use it as the name, then I like forget that it's two words, and then it's not until someone's like, "Oh, stream and yard," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's fucking obvious."
Yeah. You can
Do you know what I mean? As in like
the two together, yeah.
Yeah, you just become conditioned to seeing things in a particular way, and I think if you can train that skill, then yeah, you can.
Exactly. Why? That's why, to some extent, comedy is always like a creative act. It's re-seeing things that already exist, re-seeing words in new contexts, or re-seeing contexts, or reinterpreting a context when something's not clear. It's a bit like the "took my father out" thing. It's like, that isn't actually clear. It sounds clear because you just assume it's clear that he's taking his dad out for dinner, because that's like the most common use of that. But then obviously the whole "shot my priest" thing is like, okay.
And then I started to think like, well, you take your dad out. That sounds like a date, and obviously then that would mean you're gay, and priests are against like it all depends on your assumptions, but
I think he does build on this joke later, so you'll see some other alternatives. I think,
yeah.
And sorry, just to finish that off as well, we got the secret number 3 of the book. So the aim of reinterpretation and the punch is to shatter the target assumption. When your joke shatters people's assumptions, they laugh, and it kind of that's the whole mechanism itself.
Yeah, cool. So then, shared knowledge jokes. So, moving beyond the simplicity of one-liners, we encounter a realm Greg likes to describe as shared knowledge humor. This form of humor taps into the collective insights and experiences that are specific to certain groups. This humor manifests in 2 distinct categories. Do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, so number 1, we got jokes without performed setups. So in the realm of humor, some jokes forego the explicit setup phrase, leaning instead on the common ground of shared knowledge and experience. These kind of jokes might reference the universal quirks of daily life, cultural norms, or even widely acknowledged stereotypes, relying on the audience's inherent understanding of these concepts. And the way I thought about that when I was reading this is kind of like sort of South Park and sort of satirical humor, where they don't create punchlines for the jokes. It's funny because of the stereotypes they take the piss out of, etc. So, for example, a joke about the bewildering array of office coffee options taps into our collective experience with workplace complexities. The humor arises not from a detailed setup, but from the audience's immediate recognition of the situation, reflecting our navigation through life's unspoken rules and assumptions. This approach to joke-telling underscores how humor often resides not in what's said, but in the silent acknowledgement of a shared reality. And that's a really good point too. It doesn't have to be explicit. And I feel like what you're saying about Ricky Gervais and stuff is the same thing. It's the silent acknowledgement of, oh yeah, wait, actually running on a treadmill was a bit weird if you put it in that context.
Yeah, it's interesting. And like, just from you reading that paragraph, I was struck with the realization that you can't really create a joke from nothing, because the very essence of a joke is based on like the collective knowledge. Right?
And the assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. If they don't have that, your joke isn't funny.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, then the number 2. So, jokes without performed punches. So similarly, some jokes are crafted with an implied punchline, guiding the audience to an unspoken yet inevitable conclusion. For example, I went to this expensive restaurant that had a waiter for everything. The water waiter gave me water. The food waiter gave me food. The head waiter... The setup alone nudges the audience towards the punchline, fostering a communal understanding that completes the joke in the listener's mind without the need for explicit delivery. Hopefully you got that one. This technique showcases the elegance of...
No, I actually didn't. Can you explain it to me?
Well, a head waiter... um, the technique showcases the elegance of subtlety in humor, where the laughter is born from the anticipation of the punchline and the satisfaction of mentally arriving there together. It's a testament to the power of implication and shared amusement in the art of joke telling. And I have a feeling that this very much taps into like British humor, where we don't always say what's on our mind, right? It's not like obvious. We're not on the nose with our humor. I think we're like, one, it can be quite self-deprecating, but also it's like implied, it's implicit, it's not
Yeah, yeah.
spoken.
It doesn't need to
Yeah,
be detailed.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So now moving on to the next part about non-verbal connectors. So the most common misunderstanding of the connector is that it must be only words. Words are often used as connectors in one-liners where the setup creates the misdirection with an ambiguous word or phrase, or like a word that has multiple meanings. But the reason Greg defines a connector as one thing with at least two interpretations is that it can be anything in the universe. Open your mind and expand your comedy. So here are several examples of jokes with non-verbal connectors. Let's begin with one from a silent movie comedy using only body language as a connector. So picture this scene. A wealthy drunkard in his parlour finds a note from his wife saying that she's left him and won't return until he stops drinking. He turns away from the camera and walks to a counter. He hangs his head and his shoulders begin to shake up and down. He's sobbing, right? Crying his eyes out over losing her. Nope. He turns around and he's shaking a drink in a martini mixer. This is a perfect joke structure using the connector of body language, of the shaking of his shoulders. That motion is the thing that causes you to make the target assumption that he's crying. These mechanisms are required for all comedy, humor, and jokes on the planet. It is how the human mind processes and comprehends what's funny. And I thought that's a huge point there, where it's like, with body language, if you can signal something that people expect, like the whole idea of like, shrugging your shoulders, make it look like you're crying, and obviously shaking a martini. It kind of reminds you of the Charlie Chaplin sort of thing, because obviously there was no spoken words in that, and that's still comedic. Where it's
Yeah,
all
it's so
based
interesting,
on
isn't it? I
people
mean, like, it kind
instincts.
of goes to suggest that humor in itself is one, it's a natural byproduct of how we're programmed, right?
Yeah.
We're programmed to predict, make assumptions, and all that kind of stuff. It's just sometimes it can be like amusing for what we predict and it doesn't happen, right? What we expect. But then in that sense, any kind of humor today is like a construct. It's a bit of both, right? It's like you can purposely try and lead people to the wrong expectations, but then it also can happen so naturally. And I quite like the
Which it
kind of
does all the
duality
time,
there.
yeah. Which is
Yeah.
why I think there's the people out there who are the best when it comes to like, because the thing about like planning in advance and doing the setup and the punchline, like it's not anybody can do that, right? But it requires planning and it's not spontaneous. Whereas I think some of the other stuff, like the wit, we talked about wit a lot when communicating on the fly, the ability to see things in different ways and be able to like capitalize it on the moment. I think that's what's more impressive with this.
Yeah.
And there's always, like you said, there's plenty of ways to misinterpret things all the time because communication in general, especially with words, can be so ambiguous, especially when we have languages where certain words mean multiple things and certain situations can be interpreted in multiple ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree.
So yeah, now we got secret 4. So at the heart of every comedic piece, be it a joke, a humorous story, or any form of comedy, lies a pivotal element that can be interpreted in multiple ways. So the complexity lies in identifying dual interpretations amidst the vast array of comedic forms. The essence of comedy is often cloaked by the persona of the comedian, buried within societal or cultural beliefs, entangled in nuanced implications, nestled in collective knowledge, rooted in the narrative, influenced by the context, and veiled by unique personal expression styles. So, as you refine your ability to discern these underlying mechanisms, a new realm of understanding and appreciation for the diversity and depth of comedy will unfold before you. So, remember though, when you shatter people's assumptions, they laugh. And I quite like this because it's interesting because once you've listened to this and if you start sort of engaging with these ideas, you will see a lot of how these comedians operate. Go watch a comedy show after this, after knowing what we just talked about, and you start picking up on it much more.
Yeah. It's so funny. It's so funny how, like, as soon as you said shattered assumptions, I thought of the book Shattered Assumptions, which is about like terrible trauma, and they're just saying, if you shatter someone's assumptions, they'll laugh, and it's just.
Ooh, that's a really
But
good point.
it's funny, like, obviously
because you rebuild it up. That's the difference. I
Mm.
think that's actually the massive key difference here. It's like when you do comedy, you're breaking somebody's assumption, but you're helping them build it up in a new channel, which is why there's like, oh, it could be like that too. I think the
Yeah.
shattered assumptions almost comes from the idea of like you don't know how to interpret that event. You experience something so far from your reality that your models completely break, and there's nothing there to like reattach meaning. So like, you know, something happens, you're like, wow, I can't believe somebody would possibly like be that violent towards me, and you can't like construct a new
Yeah.
explanation or whatever.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it also touches on the fact that like some assumptions are related to models that are more impactful to your life than others, right?
Yeah.
When you go to a comedy gig, a lot of the stuff that they're joking about isn't that serious, right? But then again, some people get really offended in comedy clubs because maybe it touches on like, you know, an expectation that comes
Man,
from
there's
something
some
that's big in
comedians
their
that are
identity
super
or whatnot.
mean. There's some comedians who like will do crowd work and will absolutely rip the crap into
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
But that's also a specific type of comedy where some people find it funny, some people don't, because it
Yeah.
actually can be construed as, you know, pretty horrible.
Yeah.
Once again, but it's based on the shared assumptions. You know, like,
But
nobody's
it's
going
a
to say this
fine
is every day.
line. It's a fine line, right? As in like what's funny and what's not, or like what you claim to be a joke and what's not. Like when people are like, "Oh no, come on, I was only joking," you know,
Yeah.
it's interesting because there is it's a fine line.
Well, I guess the fine line with that type of stuff is it's probably a lot nicer when you're not taking the piss out of somebody individually. I think when you go individual, then you're going to be risking some sort of moral outrage relative
Mm,
to the person obviously being annoyed that you've just taken the piss out of them, and then also a collective who are like, well, why are you picking on this person?
yeah,
Whereas most
yeah,
other
no,
jokes are pretty harmless, you know, if you're joking about certain other things which, you know, everybody can agree upon.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
also dark
No,
humor
that's
comes
funny.
in as well when you start joking about stuff that people really think shouldn't be talked about, etc.
Yeah, but then almost that in itself is a joke, right? Like that's the type of humor where you say stuff that other people wouldn't say, and
Yeah.
because of that, it's funny.
I think so. I think that's where the origins of that, like why people laugh, because once again, it's like taking like an assumption that people have, because everybody knows the common assumption is obviously nice or not nice is bad about these things. Like you can't say them because they're so horrible, and then somebody says them, it's almost like, oh, well, you can say them, kind of thing, and everybody like
Yeah,
that's why I guess it's funny. I guess
yeah. God, it's complicated, isn't it?
it's not simple.
Yeah. All right. So then moving on to chapter 2, joke writing. So many people feel that joke writing is an elusive skill, something you either have or you don't. However, everyone has moments of humor, even unintentionally, even Jess. So
Yeah.
not understanding how you made a joke doesn't mean you haven't made one. If we can understand how jokes are structured, then writing them is possible. As mentioned before, most jokes rely on common knowledge and don't need elaborate setups. But to teach how to craft these kinds of jokes, one must first grasp the structure of more straightforward jokes that do use setups. So, learning about structured joke writing can pave the way to create more nuanced humor and storytelling.
Nice. So now we're going to move into the joke prospector. So here's a simple system to take you from a joke topic to a complete joke. So the joke prospector is Greg Dean's unique system. This system is divided into two main stages, the joke map and the joke mine. The joke map will help you pick a topic, establish a punchline premise, and develop a setup premise. From there, you generate various setups based on your initial idea. Then he has the second part, or called the joke mine, which takes you deeper, utilizing the target assumption, connector, and reinterpretation to forge the punchline. So, secret number 5 in this book was engage in questioning. Inquiries keep your search sharp and focused, opening pathways to humor by prompting a stream of new ideas. The joke prospector method prevents getting trapped in repetitive thoughts and propels you forward, potentially uncovering unexpected humorous insights. Interestingly, many comedians engage in this questioning process whether they realize it or not, either on a conscious or subconscious level.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so the joke mine. Here's how to craft hilarious punchlines easily. Greg Dean gives us his joke mine, which is a simple 5-step process to turn any setup into a hilarious punchline. Each step in the mine is guided by a specific question. So, number 1, choose a setup and listing assumptions. So, for example, what assumptions am I making about this statement? Start by writing down your joke idea and note all the assumptions that come with it. It's easier to work with your ideas on paper than trying to remember everything. Then number 2, identifying a target assumption and the connector. So, for example, what leads me to this particular assumption? Choose the assumption that will make your joke the funniest. This is often the most obvious one because it's what your audience will also think of. The connector is the key element in your setup that leads to this assumption. Then number 3, considering alternative interpretations for the connector. So the question being, what other meanings could my connector have? So look for different, surprising ways to interpret the connector. The more unexpected, the better the human potential. Then number 4, selecting an interpretation and crafting a second story. So the question being, how could my chosen interpretation logically fit into a new context relative to the setup? So choose one reinterpretation and use it to imagine a backstory or scenario. This won't be your punchline, but will shape it. You'll need to search through various situations that will help explain or justify the reinterpretation. And then lastly, number 5, creating a punchline to convey the secondary story. So the question being, what extra details do I need to communicate this new story? So your punchline should clearly and succinctly convey the secondary story. Experiment with the different wordings and choose the one that feels the funniest. So how do you decide on the exact wording for a punch? Let your sense of humor be your guide. Try many different versions and then go with the phrasing that sounds funniest to you. And that seems like a quite comprehensive, like, kind of guide. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Logically. And it's funny how, you know, when they're like, you know, go with the ones with, like, you know, the most common assumptions. It's funny because I was reminded of you know, that game. What's the one that's like really rude and you have cards, the black cards?
Cards Against Humanity.
Cards Against Humanity. So I like the game, but I like to make, like, kind of, I'll put forward cards that I think are quite layered. Like, there are lots of layers to it, but then a lot of people just don't see the layers. And so they just, like, the person who chooses whoever won that round just goes with the most, like, stupid, obvious answer. And I'm there like, well, that's fucking stupid. Obviously someone was going to play that card, but it doesn't have layers, you know?
Yeah, it's always that game is always the most grotesque. It's always like dead babies is like a game winner, isn't it? It's like whatever you can put.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Funny.
Right, we're now going to take an example run through of the joke mine. So from setup to punch. So the first step, as we just discussed, was choosing a setup and listing assumptions. So select a setup here that you think misdirects the audience and contains an ambiguity to use as a connector in the next step. So for example, I call my dad all the time. Then the question is, what assumptions am I making about this statement? So the assumptions are, A, call means to phone him. B, they're pleasant calls. C, he's my biological father. So number 2, then, we've got identifying a target assumption and the connector. So the connector is in the setup of one-liners, which these jokes are. So go through all of the words and their implied meanings to identify the one connector. So the target assumption was, call means to telephone him. So the question is, what leads me to this particular assumption? The connector, obviously there, the word call. So 3, considering alternative interpretations for the connector. The reinterpretation is the step where you create the idea for the surprise. The reinterpretations are, A, call means calling out somebody's name. B, call can means a referee making a call or a decision. Call can also mean C, which is name calling. So then you've got 4, select an interpretation and craft your second story. So the reinterpretation that we've chosen here is call means name calling. So how would my chosen interpretation logically fit into a new context relative to the setup? So A, calling my father bad names would explain why my relationship with him is bad. So they're creating a punchline. Sorry, step number 5 then is creating the punchline based on that to convey the second story. So what extra details do I need to communicate this new story? So the real challenge here is to distill the second story in your head down to just a few words. If you find you're writing a long punch, then you're describing the entire second story that's in your head instead of writing a punch. I think that's quite an interesting point as well about making the punch short and sharp, and also not explaining it. You did go a lot into this. Like, if you explain a joke, or if you if you overcook it, like if you overcook the punchline where you have a sort of, it's not a direct explanation, but you sort of overdo it where it becomes too obvious, then it's not as funny. There has to be a level of, like, ambiguity where the person figures it out for themselves to actually find it funny in the first place.
Yeah. And it is funny how wording a punchline is so important. I mean, like, everyone's experienced it where you've had this joke, it's kind of leading up, and then you say the sentence that is like the punchline, and it's not like the right wording, or it just doesn't fit and it doesn't land properly. And because it doesn't land properly, then you feel like you have to kind of explain it. I think that's quite a skill in itself, being able to, like, make it concise and all the words are perfect in the right place, you know.
100%. And I think with this, it's quite important to realize as well that maybe the first punchline you come up with won't actually be the best one. It's why the comedians go around and do their sort of little tours before they
Yes,
create
trial and error.
Exactly. They're trying their material. They're trying which punchline works best, which is the best way of saying this, which is when's the best time to pause, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. So, troubleshooting your jokes. If you find yourself disliking the joke you've developed, or if you're stuck and can't seem to progress, there's no need to worry. Simply revisit step 4 of the joke mine and select a different reinterpretation that brings a smile to your face. It's also not uncommon to craft a compelling second story only to realize it conflicts with a minor aspect of your initial setup. In such cases, don't hesitate to tweak the setup to ensure the joke lands well. Remember, in joke writing, flexibility is key. And if, after all attempts, you still aren't satisfied with any of the punchlines and it really feels like you're hitting a wall, consider stepping back to step 2. Here you can choose a different main assumption to explore. This approach ensures you always have a path forward. And yeah, I think that makes sense actually. It's funny how like flexibility is key, and I've noticed a couple things. Like when I go to see comedy gigs, there's like 2 components. There's people and their content, and then people with the audience. And the best ones are obviously people that can do both. But you find a lot of comedians who are great with the audience but have terrible content, or
Yes.
great content but literally cannot deal with the audience. And I think if you're able to be so flexible with your material and you're good at engaging with the audience, then you can make it contextualized to your audience. And that is like, when you see a comedian do that, I think that's great.
Yeah, they almost change their material slightly, potentially to benefit the audience or to be
Exactly.
relatable to the audience. Yeah, it requires. The audience work also requires, at least from after reading this book, I kind of realized that what a lot of them kind of do, I guess, is have a bunch of jobs where they already have like ready-made jokes to go, because they kind of know the main jobs they're going to receive. I saw a comedian the other day on my Instagram, and he got an absolute whopper of a job. Somebody was a war crimes investigator, and he was and you could see it just get thrown off completely. And he's like, "Oh, so where are you investigating these war crimes or whatever?" And he was like, Ukraine. And it turns out he's also from Israel. And he's like, "What the fuck is this?" But it kind of makes me laugh because they almost have their material prepared in advance. I think, especially with a lot of. And once again, do you remember when we were at the one with the underground one, or what was it? Is it underground comedy or top secret?
Top Secret Comedy
Yeah,
Club.
that's the one. A lot of his jokes were very, like, for example, one of them was like a pilot, wasn't it? So it was the pilot stereotypes. So once again, it's all based on this. It's all like, what are the assumptions people are going to make about a pilot?
Yeah.
How can I bring in the jokes around that? And then there's also like somebody who's like, was it insurance or sales? Anyway, it's always the classics where the stereotypes almost speak for themselves. It was such easy pickings. So as long as you have like a list of all the professions, to some extent, because like most of the crowd work I see is always like, what do you do?
Yeah.
You get what I mean? You can come pre-prepared for it, and it makes it look like you're good off the cuff. But the reality is, they know about 15 to 20 professions which are going to be the most common, and they probably even profile people as they walk in and go, "He looks like somebody."
Oh yeah. That's probably But that's just their perception as well. I mean, like they're probably used to finding certain people that lend really well to their content or to their jokes.
Yeah,
and
but isn't it's funny as well because the comedian I just watched as well, where he was joking, not even joking, with he asked the guy in the crowd, "What do you do?" And he's like, "I'm an investigator." And he's like, "What do you investigate?" He's like, "War crimes."
Yeah.
The reason why people were laughing in the crowd because it was just so like once again the expectation was broken. They looked at him, did not realize it would be so dark, like what he's investigating, and that's why everybody thought it was funny.
No, exactly. And like the more I think about it now, the more this kind of structure applies. I remember being there once, and the host he was great. He's this black guy, and he was like asking people in the front row. He was like, "Oh, what do you do?" And this guy's like, "Oh, we're headhunters, or like we're recruitment." And he's like, "Okay, so nothing with a personality." Once again, playing on like the assumption, right? And he's like, "So what is it? What does your job actually like entail?" And the guy goes, "Oh, we sell people." And then the black guy goes, you just said that to a black person, right?
Yeah.
And it's like all of the assumptions. It's so funny, like how they can be interpreted in so many different ways.
Yes.
It's good.
They go on.
I was going to say, actually, this reminds me. So if there are 2 stories going on, I wonder if that explains what like a meme is. So a meme, you have the visual, which is one story, and then you have the caption, which kind of is like a different
No,
story,
yes, no, I think that's
right?
exactly it. Yeah,
So you have like, yeah, because people understand it. It's like they see the caption and then they're able to apply. It's almost like
it gives
the
them the
visual.
ability to project the the reinterpretation onto the thing that's in the meme, whether
Yeah,
it's a video or a picture. Yeah,
yeah,
but
exactly.
without that, you wouldn't have that ability to reinterpret it because there's almost too many ways you can reinterpret it. But you give
Yeah.
them a very specific way to, and yeah, that's
Well,
what.
it's almost like assumption you'd probably be thinking anyway, but now it's in a visualized format being
Yeah,
shown to you, but it's not explicit. It's not like being told to you. Interesting that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll move on to the next part. So chapter 3, what to write jokes about. So there's an old adage that says, write what you know, and really, if you think about it, what else can you write? It's recommended to focus on one's personal experiences and views. Attempting to cater exclusively to presumed audience preferences in humour is ill-advised. Individuals who solely aim to appeal to what they believe others will enjoy are often referred to as hacks. Inspiration is heralded as the most effective means of generating material, offering a genuine path to creativity and authenticity. And that also does make sense as well. You should definitely be writing, or sorry, not even writing, but creating jokes about what you know. It just makes sense because then you know what the
Yeah.
assumptions are being made. Like,
Yeah.
or maybe project writing jokes for who you would somebody you would hang around with who you know shares the same assumptions. Because otherwise, you're just assuming what people assume. Obviously, that's why most comedians probably go for like pop culture references, like we just discussed with the comedians who do the crowd work, and they can just leverage the common perceptions of, like you said, recruiters or whatnot, where everybody has that perception. But otherwise,
Yeah.
you should definitely focus on what you know, and the people. As long as you know the people in your crowd are similar to yourself, therefore you know roughly what assumptions they would make too.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like doing your research at the end of the day. Like you could imagine how if a comedian goes to, another country, then there's different cultural norms and different cultural assumptions, and therefore just learn those ones so that you can make it a bit more applicable to them. But yeah, the basis of your jokes is very much based on your audience's assumptions at the end of the day. Yeah. All right, so the joke map. Now, the joke map that will allow you to survey your life for raw materials that will lead to a joke setup. So then you'll re-enter the joke mine to find punches for them. As noted by Konstantin Stanislavski, now we're diving into the whole like acting realm. I know a bit of Stanislavski. The pioneer of acting techniques, generality is the death of art. So, his acting secret number 6. The jokes are in the details. The significance of focusing on details cannot be stressed enough. Often, the struggle to generate material stems from the attempt to derive humor from broad generalizations. Now, the transition from broad concepts to specific details is the core purpose of the joke map. It facilitates the progression from selecting a topic to creating a punch premise, establishing a setup premise, and then crafting various steps. Which makes sense. You don't want to be too broad and so vague that like no one can understand where you're coming from. You want to be able to know, you want to be able to tell where you're coming from and get more specific, right? That's that whole journey that you're taking them on, that you're leading them to that expectation and
For
suddenly
sure.
change it.
And I also think at some level, the more general you go, the more likely there could be multiple assumptions.
Mm,
Whereas at least if you go kind of semi-specific, you can then guess what the best assumption is going to be related to
yeah,
whatever you're saying. Because if you go too broad, people can make many or have many different opinions and perceptions of something. So the more specific you go, that's the most popular assumption people are going to make here. Will help with the joke. So we've
absolutely.
now got the joke map, which is surveying for material. So the way to uncover hilarious topics to craft your jokes, you've got to use the joke map process. Similar to the joke mine, this involves 5 steps. So step 1 is identify potential topics. Ask yourself, which issues do I find problematic and am I eager to discuss? Part 2 is choose a topic and compile an association list. So consider what aspects are connected to my chosen topic. Part 3 is develop punch premises. Reflect on which aspects of my topic evoke strong negative feelings. Number 4 is establishing setup premises for each punch premise. So question is, what is the contrasting positive viewpoint to my punch premise? And then part 5 is select a setup premise, and generate setups. Think about what examples or phrases best convey my setup premise. And after completing the joke map, you're ready to advance to the subsequent stage of the joke prospector, which is the joke mine. And I can't remember for what reason he decided to do this part after the joke mine, because in the book
Yeah, that's
it
interesting.
was joke mine followed by joke map. And I don't know whether he's trying to build on the fact that his first chapter was all about breaking expectations, so it made logical sense to go straight into the anatomy of creating a sort of punchline before then moving on to sort
Yeah,
of more
maybe.
creative mind mapping association list related to topics.
All right, so moving on. So, topic. In Greg's advanced workshops, participants often gravitate towards topics they perceive as fun, yet they rarely find viable material. However, when they explore areas filled with conflicts, issues, and problems, they uncover a rich vein of content. It's why Jess is so funny, you know.
So much pain.
Yeah, questions posed to guide them through their problem areas frequently elicit the response, but that's not funny. Indeed, a topic by itself isn't humorous. It's the painful experiences that pave the way to comedic gold. The selection of a topic should be evaluated based on the potential details it offers. A suitable topic should meet the criteria of being a focused subject that showcases a discrepancy or problem. Crucially, a topic should remain free of opinions. Its role is to serve as a starting point, broad enough to spawn a multitude of details for exploration. So, with that, here's acting secret. Bloody hell, God, comedy secret number 7. So, the development of humor has been linked to its ability to help individuals deal with distressing situations. As a result, the seeds of comedy often lie hidden within painful experiences. And I don't think that could be true enough. I mean, it is genuinely the kind of like conflict, the problems, the issues that make something so funny. And I think part of it is like, what's the alternative? The alternative is to like, you know, look at life in such a serious way and just constantly feel, pain or suffering or whatnot, whatever is related to these things. Whereas, humor is a coping mechanism at the end of the day, right? Like people deal with like sad. It's like if you've ever gone to a funeral, like some people deal with it in weird ways, right? And it's like comedy and humor is a way of dealing with a lot of that. And it's amazing how much it comes out of like, distress essentially at the end of the day. I can relate to that. The encouragement here is to craft jokes centered around subjects perceived as problematic or adverse. Embedded within every joke is an element of discomfort or pain, stemming from our reactions to perceived wrongs, which can vary from deep anguish to slight unease.
Yeah. So now moving on to the next part of the topic selection, so the association list. So remember that details are more important than categories. After selecting a topic, it's essential to compile an association list related to that topic, as guided by the joke map. This list should be rich in details rather than broad categories. For example, choosing sports as a topic might initially lead to a list such as baseball, tennis, football, ice hockey, etc. However, these items are too general and serve as categories rather than specific details. So the key to uncovering humour lies within these details. To refine the approach, one should narrow the focus to a specific category like baseball and then generate an association list that includes precise details related to that category, such as stealing a home. Stealing a home, Jesus, that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Umpire, foul ball, and I love it because I'm butchering this because I'm not American, and a strike. This method ensures that the elements ripe for comedy are detailed and specific. And this actually reminds me, and we might cover this book in the future, but there's a book called, got it here, The Serious Guide to Joke Writing by Sally Holloway. I haven't finished it yet, but it's very similar to this, where she actually goes more in depth rather than Greg Dean, which is a bit more sort of like a roller coaster. She goes into the brainstorming of ideas way more. And I thought she was quite interesting. She was talking a lot about creating mind maps and basically once you've got your category, just firing out random words in all sort of directions. And then from those words, trying to fire them in other places and see if you can find a way to navigate all your way back in a way that makes like a joke.
Yeah.
And I thought that's quite a good way of doing it too.
Absolutely. What book was it that we read where we were kind of talking about an association list?
Could it be The Art of Explanation, maybe?
I was thinking that, but what was it based on? Was it like questions that they were talking about? Like the
you're right, exactly. It was when you're having to explain a topic, I think. So you have to like brainstorm out the association relative to the topic, or like mind map out the key points, and then from there you decide which one's the most important, I think.
Yeah. I think it was
I'll have to
something
double
along
check
those
that.
lines. But yeah, I think it's a skill in itself to be able to just ramble off different associations, because also I think that helps you when it's like spontaneous. It's like humor when you're just having a chat with someone, because you see the different ways that it can go and you can quickly go down there. Yeah. And it's funny because like reading all of this, right, it almost seems like for comedians, I mean, to be an actual comedian, you have to do your homework, you have to do your work and constantly refine your jokes, which makes it quite methodical. And you would think then that there would probably be like more comedy books, because more comedians are like kind of, I don't know, at it all the time. You know, it's like a writer. Essentially, they have to work on their
Yeah,
craft
well,
all the time,
some
but
of
it's
them
like
are, I think.
intentional.
But
Yeah,
some of the times, maybe if they got like a really good system, they don't want to like share it as well.
maybe. Yeah, maybe.
But it's a lot of it is putting in the reps, from what I gathered from this. It's kind of like, because you're never going to find that amazing joke. You just got to like, I'm pretty sure it was either Jerry Seinfeld or something. He
I
wrote
think,
like,
yeah.
jokes every day. I think Greg even references him in this book, just talking about like how the sheer volume, like, and even his approach to it is like, I'm not going to write a great joke every day, but if I stick to it every day and I do it 365 days a year, eventually, at least 10% of them are going to be good ones.
Yeah.
And we'll cover the joke file later, but you can store those jokes for later and then reuse them with potential new sort of connectors, etc. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so the punch premise. After choosing an appropriate topic, the next step is to refine it into a more focused idea, referred to here as the punch premise. A punch premise is essentially a critical viewpoint on a subject related to the topic, encompassing negative perceptions, judgments, emotions, beliefs, and values. Given that the starting point involves identifying something problematic, negative perspectives naturally emerge, encompassing all details connected to the topic in some way. So here is how you would go about creating a punch premise. It's crucial to note that a punch premise must not include any specific examples. The role of the punch premise is multifaceted. So, 1. It compels the selection of a particular subject for the joke or routine, along with a negative stance on that subject, ensuring focus and clarity. And then number 2, it serves as an underlying message or theme of the joke or routine. And number 3, it limits the scope to the chosen subject and the negative viewpoint, ensuring the punch premise remains focused and relevant. A well-constructed punch premise is vital for the effectiveness of this system. An imprecise punch premise can derail the entire creative process, highlighting the importance of careful and thoughtful development of this foundational element. I mean, yeah, makes sense, doesn't it?
yes. So now we've got the punch premise. We can now move on to the setup premise. So a setup premise involves the same subject as before, but adopts a contrasting, more positive viewpoint. So typically, setups and punchlines contrast either directly, transitioning from positive to negative, or in intensity, evolving from negative to a more negative scenario. Jokes that follow a positive to negative pattern are direct opposites, where the setup highlights a positive aspect and the punchline unveils a negative outcome. Regardless of whether the joke transitions from positive to negative, or from negative to even more negative, the direction always leans towards increasing negativity. So, forming a setup premise. This step might seem overly simplistic, but it's crucial to recognize that it introduces the concept of opposites into the joke writing process. So consider this example about mail delivery. The punch premise is the incompetence in mail delivery, and the setup premise is the competence in mail delivery systems. It's important not to directly use the setup premise as the setup itself. And I thought that's quite interesting about the sort of negative to negative. I quite like the idea of jokes where it's like already negative, but it just gets worse. It's like when somebody tells you a story where like you thought shit was bad and it just got worse.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous sketch with I think it's like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, who are like two famous like comedians, and they're doing exactly that, where they're like out competing on how terrible their like children their childhood was or something like that. It's like a joke. They're playing like characters, but essentially like, oh, you think that was bad, well, I had cancer all over here, and he's like, oh, you think that's bad, and they just keep going, and it's like funny because it's like so outrageous, but they're just like making it more and more negative for each iteration. Yeah, it's funny. All right, so writing setups. The setup premise serves as the foundation from which you'll generate a sequence of setups, drawing on instances that illustrate the setup premise. To unearth positive instances, try these methods. Reflect on an actual negative situation involving the subject and invert it to a positive one. And then consider the ideal behavior of the subject to derive positive examples. The purpose of framing the setup premise positively is to create setups that lead the audience in one direction, only for the punchlines to reveal a contrasting negative twist. Guidelines for writing setups. Stick to one idea per setup. Keep setups straightforward and focused. Overloading them with multiple concepts can confuse the audience. And 2, compose setups as brief statements. For clarity and brevity, initial setups should be succinct. They can be adjusted for a more natural flow later. And lastly, look for ambiguities. Ambiguities are valuable for their multiple interpretations, serving as potential connectors in the joke. Crafting setup is often more challenging than devising punchlines, with the key difficulty lying in finding the right setup. And that's a big one, I think, like when you can see or ambiguity, it's definitely where the gold is, because you're like preying on what people are projecting into that.
There's even detecting like ambiguous words where you can just reinterpret it.
Yeah.
Immediately. I've still got the one from earlier in my mind. Right. So, chapter 4, from funny to funnier, improving and polishing your gems. The craft of comedy hinges on precise delivery and timing, governed by the principle that there is no writing, only rewriting. This saying underscores the essence of humour writing, which is its continuous evolution through revision. So, if you want some easy ways to help refine your jokes, then here are 5 strategies that Greg Dean recommends. So 1, keep jokes short. A joke burdened with superfluous words loses its punch. The humour must strike swiftly, requiring jokes to be direct and to the point for immediate comprehension and laughter. For example, trimming a verbose setup to the essentials can transform a languid joke into a quick-fire zinger. 2, end the punch with a reveal. Every punchline contains a crucial element, a word, phrase, or action that flips the script and breaks the initial assumption. This element must come at the very end to maintain suspense and maximize impact. An effective punchline doesn't precede the reveal with unnecessary filler. 3, unnecessary words are said or actions are performed after the reveal. Continuing beyond the reveal can undermine the joke's impact. It's akin to explaining a joke after the punchline, redundant and counterproductive. The reveal should be the climax, after which the audience's laughter is the only desired response. 4, use words or phrases with hard consonants. Or usually I say consonants. Can you believe it? This is actually hilarious. Oh my god. Sounds play a subtle yet pivotal role in humour. Hard consonants. Hard consonants, particularly K, sounds have an intrinsic comedic quality. The sharpness of these sounds can make words like crack or quack inherently funnier, a technique leveraged by many comedians to punch up their delivery. And this is one of my favourites right at the end. It's Shall I redo that? Shall I redo that or not?
No, don't.
No,
keep it.
Keep it in.
I want consonants in there because Jesse's going to find it and he's going to make it a clip.
It's funny because actually the moment when I was about to read it, I remembered the point being about like really hard hitting words, and the first thing that came to my head was obviously that word. So when I said it, it just came out like, whoa.
That's amazing. That's a new one. Yeah.
Cool. This is actually this is my favourite. 5, rhythms of 3. So the rule of 3, as we covered in many other communication books, establishes the rhythm, setting up an expectation with the first 2 elements and subverting it with the third. This pattern is crucial for pacing and misdirection, so keep an eye out for opportunities to create a list, which is key, as it often signals the setup for a humorous twist. So here are 2 classic examples of the rhythm of 3. So Steve Martin once quipped, "I'm very sensitive. When I see a beautiful woman, I want to cry, write poetry, and jump on her." And then from student Eduardo Alfonso, "As a nurse, I have to be knowledgeable about drugs, including their dosages, side effects, and yes, even their street value." And I quite like the idea of just, using lists to just find something that sort of subverts the sort of standard.
Yeah, because already it's like ingrained in us to think in like 3s and also build suspense.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. You're just like capitalizing on it. You're leveraging it. Yeah, funny. All right, so moving on. So advanced tips and tricks. So number 1, shared knowledge. Tailor your joke's reference to your audience's understanding. An obscure reference can alienate listeners, while a well-known one can spark instant recognition. If a joke hinges on less common knowledge, weave the explanation seamlessly into the setup to avoid losing the audience's connection. And number 2, make characters specific. So, richly detailed characters lend authentically and relatability to jokes. For instance, describing a quirky habit or a distinctive look can bring a fictional uncle to life in the audience's imagination, making the joke more engaging and memorable. Refer to the characters in your jokes as friends or relatives rather than nebulous persons, or use actual public figures. Comics often make up fictional siblings and relatives to personalize their jokes. Then, localized references. So, incorporating local references not only personalizes your material, but also strengthens the audience's connection to it. Mentioning a notorious traffic spot or a beloved local diner can elicit a stronger, more personal reaction than generic settings. Something magical happens when an audience sees their hometown immortalized in your show. This technique works well, so well, in fact, that some comics actually poo-poo it for being too easy to pull off. Then calendar reference. So, aligning jokes with holidays or significant events taps into collective consciousness, making humor more timely and relevant. A Christmas joke shared during the holiday season, for example, can resonate more deeply due to its immediate relevance. Then there's grammatically incorrect language. So embrace the fluidity of language, whether it's through inventing new words like consonants and employing grammatical idiosyncrasies or cleverly misusing idioms. Playful manipulation of language can open up new avenues for humor. Then make up words. So comedic license permits comedians to muck around with language for the purpose of making jokes. For instance, Robin Williams had this take on divorce. Divorce comes from the old Latin word divorcerum, meaning having your genitals torn out through your wallet. You should feel completely free to play around with language. Don't worry about the rules you learned in school. Language is your comedic clay, and you should mash and twist it in any way you think. Mash.
Yeah,
Mash that.
yeah, no, that's what I thought exactly when I heard that word. It's funny how words can get like hit into your brain in certain contexts. I've just heard in a funny way.
So yeah, literally so funny. All right, so then we've got visualization and act out. So demonstrating a joke through action often surpasses verbal description in effectiveness. Visual humor, like miming being cramped in a tiny car, can be more evocative and engaging than merely talking about the experience. And then we have punning with purpose. So puns, when used strategically rather than by your dad, can serve as clever misdirection. Positioning a pun with the setup rather than the punchline can enhance the element of surprise, steering clear of predictability that often leads to groans. And then we have audience interaction and comebacks. So be prepared for varied reactions, including groans. A witty retort to an audience's groan can turn a tepid response into a laughter-filled moment, showcasing your quick wit and keeping the show's energy high. That's like what's his name? What's Alan Carr? Is it Alan Carr? Yeah,
Possibly.
guy with the funny laugh. Is that
he gay?
Yeah,
Yeah.
He's very good at the one-liners and like getting back to the audience.
I think also a lot of that's done in the preparation. In fact, he talks about it.
Yes, I think I've
We
heard
won't
him
cover it
literally
today
say
in the
them
book,
again.
but yeah,
Yeah,
a lot of it's
yeah,
covered. Like they almost have set up phrases for when they bomb or when they get what's the word? Is it haggled? No, heckled.
yeah.
When they get heckled, they
Heckled,
have like
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Haggled while
Yeah.
they're doing a little comedy show. That'd be funny. Sight gags. Sometimes seeing it is funnier than hearing. Don't be afraid to try acting out scenes instead of talking about them. Do be careful about using props though. If the joke really needs it and you shouldn't mind carrying it around, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using a prop. And that's like who's the guy that I was talking about? Peter Ustinov. He would do a lot of that. He would like act out his characters because he was so good at embodying them. Like he'd play the Queen, and he'd do like. It's funny because there's like playing on the relevant like knowledge, the communal knowledge of like everyone knows the Queen. Everyone knows the like little quips that she does, or the way that she spoke, or anything like that. And so he would be so good at like putting on like characterizations of people. But yeah, if you're shit, then don't do it.
Yes, exactly. Some comedians are really well known because they're so good at it, and then some,
Yeah,
probably best not to.
yeah.
Depends what you feel more comfortable with. So now we're moving on to enhancing the humour with joke tagging. So in the world of comedy, tagging refers to the technique of appending additional punchlines to a joke that has already reached its initial conclusion. This method significantly amplifies the humour, effectively increasing your laughter per minute rate during a performance. Instead of the majority of stage time being dedicated to setting up jokes, tagging allows for a denser concentration of punchlines, thus elevating the overall comedic impact. And to be fair, it kind of reminds me a little bit of like repeating a joke further along down the line of the show, like re-referencing maybe a joke. It's kind of what you do with your friends as well. When something funny happens at the beginning of an event, you just re-reference it again and again and again. It almost becomes funnier by default.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tagging employs 3 distinct approaches. So number 1 is leveraging the original target assumption. So for example, for Father's Day, I took my father out. Segs into the punchline. For Father's Day, I took my father out of his cage. This immediately followed by the tag made it easier to throw him off a cliff. Therefore, both the punchline and the tag dismantle the same initial assumption that taking out signifies a celebratory outing, reinterpreting it as physically removing and then disposing of the father. I quite like that.
Yeah.
I took him out of his cage, then threw him off a cliff. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, 2, building on a different initial assumption. So this method involves revisiting the initial setup of assumptions to unearth new angles for humor. By delving back into the original context with fresh eyes, you can discover alternate interpretations that lend themselves to additional punchlines. And then 3 is introducing a new assumption prompted by the second story. So for instance, the punchline, for Father's Day I took my father out, it only took 7 shots, is expanded upon with the tag, I could always drink him under the table. This approach cleverly shifts the meaning of taking out from an implication of murder to one of out drinking someone with shots, transitioning once again from bullets to alcoholic beverages. This pivot introduces a new narrative layer based on the reinterpretation provided by the tag. I mean, it's pretty complicated at that point, but you can see why it's quite funny and quite layered. How they're just basically playing around with you. 1 minute you're thinking, took my father out and 7 shots, oh crap. And then it's, I could always drink him under the table. Like, once again, it's gone back to being nice.
Yeah.
So utilizing the joke mind technique is the invaluable method for crafting tags. After establishing a punchline, reassess the joke's premises and explore what new assumptions have emerged. This iterative process of questioning and reevaluation can unveil further comedic potential within the same setup. Mastering the art of tagging can transform a simple chuckle into a roaring laugh, making it a crucial skill for any comedian aiming to maximize their humor's potency. Your setup should include just enough information to establish your target assumption. The less time it takes to get a laugh, the more laughs you get per minute, and the LPMs at the end will end up getting you a comedy job. So, secret number 8. Energy spent by the audience thinking is energy taken away from laughing. And he reiterated this a lot throughout the book, which is like the whole game is trying to get laughs per minute, which I thought was quite like a new approach to things. But so yeah, you got to be continuously trying to make people laugh. But obviously, I mean, for us, this book is less about obviously doing a stand-up comedian, like sort of what do you call it, like an actual like being a stand-up comedian. We're more just trying to understand how jokes actually work and maybe even develop some level of wit. But yeah,
no, but it makes sense. I mean, like, you know, the more time they spend thinking about it, the less they'll be in tune with what you're talking about, you know.
Also, I think laughter is almost like based on momentum, isn't it? Like the more you're laughing, the more you're in like a laughing mood, everything becomes funnier. It's like when you try and hold it all in, and you and your mate are staring at like each other at class, and you just can't stop because it's just so funny.
Yeah,
I feel that's
when you're at a wedding.
Yeah, when you're at a wedding, so true.
All right, so moving on, chapter 5, assembling a routine builder. So acting, oh fuck, I keep saying acting. I don't know why. Comedy secret number 9. So maintain a joke and routine file. Maintaining a well-organized joke and routine file is a crucial technique for comedians and writers to manage their material effectively. This method involves a systematic approach to recording, organizing, and refining jokes and gags for easy retrieval and routine assembly. And like, I mean, if you've ever watched anything where there's a comedian, they always have their book, right? They always have the little like notepad that they like write things in. I mean, always. Because also they're also thinking about things. They see something in a different like perspective, and they're like, "Oh, I want to write that down."
Yeah, that could be a topic of interest, right? It's like, "Oh, that I just saw something happen in this restaurant, and that's quite interesting. Maybe I could turn this into a joke."
Exactly. So creating a joke file. So you want to create a database or system. Utilize index cards or a digital program that allows for comparisons to catalog jokes and gags. Each piece of material should be recorded separately for better organization. Then number 2, tag your jokes by category. So consider a joke by Frank Olivier. All my friends say I'm paranoid. Well, I didn't actually hear them say it. So you see, this joke would be categorized under paranoia, psychology, and friends, enabling easy access when needed for related topics. And then number 3, routine practice. Aim to write 10 jokes daily for 4 days. On the 5th day, refine the best ones and categorize them. This practice not only fosters creativity, but also builds a substantial repository over time, as demonstrated by Tim Simpson, who amassed over 15,000 entries in nearly a decade. I mean, fair enough. Yeah, that's kudos to him.
Yeah.
Kudos to good old Tim.
There you go. And then from there, you're going to start looking to developing a routine. We will touch on this briefly. This will be the last chapter before it gets more into the practicing. But if you're looking to develop a routine, you need to follow the following process. So 1 is individual indexing. You should place each joke on a separate index card or line in a digital document. Include any directly related tags on the same card to maintain their connection. 2, you then look into categorization. So grouping your jokes into categories by a theme or a subject. This step requires evaluating the material and organizing it into a cohesive group, simplifying the assembly process for your routines. Then you have 3, which is logical sequencing. So once you've categorized, you need to then arrange the joke so that each thought naturally leads into the next. This will create a seamless flow of ideas, although some jokes might not fit neatly into this structure and maybe can be placed into a miscellaneous category. Then you've got 4, which is the refinement process. So the most critical and complex step involves rewriting the material. Reading jokes aloud can reveal awkward transitions, overwriting, or unnatural phrasing, necessitating further refinement. And like everything, once again, it's just the continuous evolution and refining of the stuff you've created.
Yeah, exactly. And then moving on to the last bit now. So guidelines for rewriting a routine. So number 1, introduce the routine. Begin by conversing about your topic, framing the routine with a clear subject matter or punch premise that sets the stage for the jokes to follow. Then utilize segues, so transition smoothly between categories without relying on outdated or cliched methods. A thoughtful pause can often serve as an effective segue, signaling a shift in topic or tone. And I mean, like, you see that all the time with comedians when they're like, so I've recently been watching this TV show, you know, and it's like straight away, it's like that's the topic that they're going to lead you down.
Yeah.
All right, so then we have conversational tone. So aim for a natural conversational style in your delivery. This approach makes the material more relatable and engaging to the audience. And then lastly, storyline integration. So consider creating a storyline or thematic thread that ties your jokes together. This doesn't need to be a complex narrative, but should provide a cohesive path through the various categories. So by following these structured steps and guidelines, you can effectively organize your comedy material, making it easier to craft compelling routines that resonate with audiences. And there we are.
There we go.
That's it.
We can give a brief overview of the rest of the book. So you've got chapter 6,
Mhm.
which is more about acting out different POVs. There's a narrator, self POV, and characters. This is more for when you're actually developing a routine. Then there's other chapters around.
And you've got chapter 7, which is rehearsing. Then you've got Greg Dean's rehearsal process, because that's obviously different from just rehearsing in general.
So this is what I mean. Then it gets even weirder. You've got chapter 9, which is like microphone techniques. So it gets very, very specific.
Well, maybe we should read some of that.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. You got to get a proper grip. Are you holding your microphone correctly?
Yeah, I'm here.
You grip it. Good.
Hello.
So yeah,
then you have peak performance. And then we have, what's next?
You've got fearless performing. I don't know if I skipped the chapter there. But then getting experience, yes, it talks about how to get actual experience, then making a good show great. But yeah, so we've covered from our perspective the essentials for if somebody's looking to increase their sort of wit, or the secrets to writing a good joke, etc. If you do want to obviously go into stand-up comedy, we would recommend getting the actual full book and be able to practice the later stages such as rehearsing. But for our intents and purposes, it was more to just disclose or talk about how to create good jokes, what is the anatomy of a joke, the techniques that comedians use, such as having files with categorized jokes, as well as looking for words that can act as connectors. I think is a really important point. But I think that's a good overview in terms of like a brief whistle stop tour of like how to create a joke and how to see comedy.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, you have, written up the whole book. You have summarized the whole book. It's not like we've only summarized the first 5 chapters. So if you do want to check out the other chapters, make sure to head on over to the website, where it will be waiting for you. And yeah, there we go. I like it. I do like reading about comedy. It is interesting because for some reason it's like kept separate from the kind of theoretical or scientific world where you can like logically kind of analyze it, but actually as soon as you dive in, you're like, oh wow, this is so intriguing, this is so interesting.
And it really does help. And I just think I think also once again it is the point of which we've discovered in the art of explanation, everything, the preparation almost makes it like comedians. The reason why they're so funny and maybe perceived as being naturally funny is because they're always looking for material, they're always looking for connectors, they're always looking for words that they can just say in a different way. And it's almost like a frame of mind that you can get yourself into just by, trying to think through these things as you hear things like, oh, what about that word? Can I think of that in a different context, etc.? So yeah, maybe what we'll do if people enjoy this, and we did enjoy this, so we can move on to maybe the guide to joke writing that I was talking about earlier, which is less about this first and second story, but it also has very similar elements about how to write a punch, etc. But also talks a lot about this association list and going about actually creating this like mind map of ideas. And I think what's more important for me, at least from that, would be maybe even mind mapping words that have multiple meanings that are commonly said, and then having really good quips ready to use at any point. And you could instantly, I reckon, become funnier just by having these words could be interpreted in multiple ways.
Yeah. What is the term for that? Is it antonym? No, there's like a term for a word that has multiple meanings.
Like if something has a synonym, it's the same
well,
meaning.
Synonym is like a similar word, but there's a word.
So you mean one word that has multiple meanings? I think you could be right about antonym, actually.
It's called a polysemous.
Okay. Oh, if there's a polysemous dictionary, that'd be interesting. Then you could filter by the most common words. That's cool. So that was, what was it again? I've got to roll it. Step by Step to Stand-Up Comedy by Greg Dean. So that's a wrap.